On October 30th, 2025, the official website of the British royal family, royal.uk, published a statement from Buckingham Palace announcing a formal process to remove the style, titles, and honors of Prince Andrew. It ended with a line about victims and survivors. Between those two bookends, a man born second in line to the British throne was compressed into 3 civilian words: Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. The statement specified what would happen next. His lease on Royal Lodge, a 30-room mansion in Windsor Great Park where he'd lived for more than 20 years, would be surrendered. Formal notice had been served. He'd moved to alternative private accommodation on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, privately funded by his brother, the King. His daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, would keep their titles as princesses. Then came a sentence that no previous palace communication about Andrew had included. Addressed not to Andrew, but to the public. Their Majesties wish to make clear that their thoughts and utmost sympathies have been, and will remain with, the victims and survivors of any and all forms of abuse. The BBC, AP, and Royal.uk all carried identical wording. Royal historian Kelly Swaby told the BBC the language was very brutal. She added, "Ordinary people don't care about the semantics. They want to see punishment, and public opinion is very much against Andrew. The palace knows that, and the language very much reflects that." But this wasn't simply a decision made in October 2025. The break began in November 2019, was formally locked in January 2022, and was publicly codified in October 2025. Everything that followed, every stripped title, every surrendered lease, every carefully phrased statement, was part of that staged process. The question is, when exactly the door closed, and why every attempt to reopen it was dead before it started. Trace the visible evidence backward. By late 2025, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor had no military affiliations, no royal patronages, no HRH styling, no public duties, no Duke of York title, no Prince title. People magazine noted his biography appeared to have been quietly removed from the royal family's website. He'd been excluded from Garter Day, absent from Trooping the Colour, banned from the Buckingham Palace balcony for the late Queen's Platinum Jubilee in 2022. His membership at the Savage Club, one of London's oldest bohemian gentlemen's clubs, founded in 1857, was formally withdrawn, according to a notice obtained by reporters. Other private clubs followed suit, declining to renew memberships or extend invitations. One source told reporters he'd been effectively socially quarantined. No supplied authoritative source, across BBC, Reuters, AP, The Guardian, CNN, People, or CBS, shows Andrew being restored to public royal duties, patronages, or military roles at any point between November 2019 and the present day. Not a single one. 3 distinct official moments produced this outcome. 3 palace statements, 3 reductions in status. October 30th, 2025, when King Charles removed his remaining titles and residence. January 13th, 2022, when Queen Elizabeth stripped his military affiliations and patronages. And November 20th, 2019, when Andrew stepped back from public duties. Together, they form a sequence so clean it looks administrative, an institution managing a liability in the most orderly way it knows how. Not through one explosive act, but through staged, escalating cuts. Duties first, then affiliations, then identity itself. The operational collapse, the moment the internal support structure actually fell, took 6 days. It began on the evening of November 14th, 2019, inside Buckingham Palace, in a room prepared for a BBC Newsnight interview. Emily Maitlis, the program's lead presenter, sat across from Prince Andrew, Duke of York, the Queen's second son. A BBC camera crew, led by cinematographer Mark Harrison, recorded the conversation. It would run 58 minutes. The interview had been 6 months in the making. Newsnight's planning producer, Sam McAllister, had repeatedly requested access over the years. Andrew's team initially proposed an interview about his charity work. Newsnight turned it down. The program would only proceed, Esme Wren, Newsnight's editor, later explained, if no questions were off the table. Then, a few weeks before the recording, the palace renewed contact. A couple of weeks ago, they said they were ready to do an interview with no subject off the table, Wren told reporters. On the Monday before filming, Mateless and a small team entered the palace to discuss the interview with Andrew and his staff. He wanted to learn more about Newsnight, Wren said. He told them he would refer up, which Wren interpreted as checking with the Queen. On Tuesday, his team confirmed the recording would go ahead. They wanted to move quickly. Throughout the week, Mateless practiced her approach. Wren played Andrew in rehearsals, drilling questions back and forth. A lot of this was tone and how we're going to deliver this, Wren recalled. Speak normally. Don't turn away. When Wren realized the significance of the material, she contacted the BBC Two controller, Patrick Holland, who agreed to broadcast a special one-off Saturday night edition rather than burying it in the regular weeknight slot. Not everyone in Andrew's circle supported the decision. Jason Stein, a press advisor who'd worked for the prince for barely a fortnight, told Andrew not to do the interview. Friends of Stein confirmed he left his position by mutual consent shortly before filming. Amanda Thirsk, Andrew's private secretary, took a different view. A former banker who'd worked with him for more than a decade, Thirsk had been originally hired to manage his financial affairs and worked her way up to the top job in 2012, taking responsibility for shaping the prince's reputation, despite having no background in public relations. Former members of the household described being survivors of her management style, while noting her total loyalty to Andrew. Thirsk felt the public would come around if they saw Andrew explain himself in his own words. The Daily Telegraph later quoted palace insiders who accused Andrew's private office of operating in a silo and said the Queen was only made aware of the interview after it had been set up, implying she had no opportunity to veto it. The interview aired Saturday, November 16, 2019. In it, Andrew said he'd met Jeffrey Epstein, the American financier and convicted sex offender who'd been found dead in a New York jail cell 3 months earlier while awaiting trial on sex trafficking charges in 1999 through Ghislaine Maxwell. He said he didn't regret the friendship. The people that I met and the opportunities that I was given to learn either by him or because of him were actually very useful, he told Mateless. He denied having sex with Virginia Giuffre on March 10, 2001, as she had alleged. His alibi: he'd been at home with his daughters after attending a party at Pizza Express in Woking with his elder daughter, Princess Beatrice. He said he had no recollection of ever meeting Giuffre. He questioned the authenticity of a photograph showing him with his arm around Giuffre's waist at Maxwell's London residence, saying he'd had investigations carried out, but the results were inconclusive. He claimed the clothes he wore in the photo were his traveling clothes, not what he'd wear when out in London. Then came the exchange that would define the interview for years. Giuffre had described Andrew as sweating heavily during an encounter at a nightclub. Andrew said this was impossible. He'd suffered an adrenaline overdose during the Falklands War, he explained, which had temporarily left him unable to sweat. Several doctors told the Times afterward that the explanation made no medical sense. Adrenaline overdose typically causes excessive sweating, not the absence of it. He admitted to staying at Epstein's Manhattan mansion for 3 days in 2010, after Epstein's conviction for sex offenses against a minor. He described the residence as a convenient place to stay. The visit's purpose, he said, was to break off the friendship in person, the honorable and right thing to do. He called himself too honorable a person. Peter Mancusi, an associate teaching professor at Northeastern University with a background in public relations, would later assess the damage. There's a way to not admit to anything, but also to express empathy for the victims. He did none of that, and I think that's what people really noticed. His colleague Michelle Carr, who teaches a course on British culture, said, "It raised more questions and concerns than it answered about his involvement with Epstein. It only furthered people's interest in the story." What happened immediately after the recording stopped is one of the most telling details in the entire story. According to The Guardian, Andrew was so pleased with how things had gone that he gave the Newsnight team a tour of the palace afterward. "I think he appreciated the fact that he'd had plenty of time to say his piece and that there hadn't been interruptions," one person involved in the recording told the paper. There was a sense on both sides that there had been a generous amount of time and he had been allowed to speak. He was incredibly gracious afterwards. The public saw something very different. The interview was described in press coverage as a car crash, as nuclear explosion level bad, and, according to multiple outlets, as the worst public relations crisis for the royal family since the death of Diana, Princess of Wales. The Guardian wrote that it revealed a grotesque mismatch between the Duke of York's language and demeanor and the gravity of the allegations which continue to surround him, between the obtuse self-absorption of a prince and what we know of the appalling sexual exploitation of teenage girls by his friend. Hannah Bardell, then the MP for Livingston, called the interview sickening. NPR reported the backlash was immediate enough to trigger institutional action within days. CNN confirmed the same timing. On November 20th, 2019, 4 days after the broadcast, Buckingham Palace announced that Andrew was stepping back from public duties for the foreseeable future. Andrew's own statement said it had become clear to me over the last few days that his association with Epstein had become a major distraction to the royal family's work. CNN reported he said the Queen had given him permission to step back. The dominoes fell quickly after that. He relinquished his role as Chancellor of the University of Huddersfield. KPMG announced it wouldn't renew its sponsorship of Pitch at Palace, his entrepreneurial scheme. Standard Chartered withdrew its support. Oxford University research found that Andrew's stepback simultaneously ended his patronage of around 60 UK charities. He would eventually be stripped of all 230 patronages. The Guardian's 2023 retrospective called it the car crash interview which destroyed Prince Andrew. A GPB feature described it as a masterclass in how to give terrible answers, singling out Andrew's description of Epstein's home as a convenient place to stay, and his characterization of Epstein's offending as unbecoming. In 2024, Mateless reflected on the interview's impact, saying it cost Andrew his public duties, his ability to wear uniform, and much of the nation's respect. She mentioned being pulled aside about a month after the broadcast by someone close to then Prince Charles. The person said only, HRH wasn't unhappy with the interview. Mateless spent years puzzling over those words. She speculated it could mean Charles didn't blame her, or, she said, that in some way it wasn't unhelpful for a reset between the royal family and the British public. She recalled the Queen's Christmas speech that year, how the piano held only a few photographs, how there was a sense of a shift. "I kind of think back to those words," Mateless said, "and think, I wonder if that was the beginning of the reset." November 2019 was the break, but for more than 2 years afterward, Andrew retained his military affiliations, his royal patronages, his HRH styling, and his constitutional residue as a counselor of state. Frozen in limbo, not active but not formally removed. 8 British regiments, including the Grenadier Guards where he held the title of colonel, waited in this suspended state. The palace had described his military appointments as in abeyance. The limbo allowed an ambiguity that some inside the institution may have preferred. It avoided the finality of a formal severance. The ambiguity ended on January 13, 2022. The trigger was a ruling issued the day before by U.S. District Judge Lewis Kaplan in New York. Virginia Giuffre had filed a civil lawsuit against Andrew in August 2021, alleging she had been trafficked by Epstein and his associate Ghislaine Maxwell and forced to have sex with Andrew when she was 17. Andrew denied the allegations. His lawyers moved to dismiss the case. On January 12th, Judge Kaplan rejected that motion, ruling Giuffre could pursue claims that Andrew battered her and intentionally caused her emotional distress. The ruling meant Andrew faced the prospect of giving evidence under oath, possibly at a trial between September and December 2022. The next day, not weeks later, not after deliberation that stretched into February, but the very next day, Buckingham Palace acted. The statement said, "With the Queen's approval and agreement, the Duke of York's military affiliations and royal patronages have been returned to the Queen. The Duke of York will continue not to undertake any public duties and is defending this case as a private citizen." Returned to the Queen is a phrase engineered to make seizure sound consensual. Military affiliations aren't something you voluntarily return. They were taken. But the palace chose language that framed a devastating institutional separation as an administrative transfer. The BBC added supplementary detail. Prince Andrew, 61, will continue not to undertake any public duties and is defending the case as a private citizen. That designation, private citizen, was the institutional lock. Until January 13th, Andrew was still associated with 8 regiments. He was still Colonel of the Grenadier Guards, still Honorary Air Commodore of RAF Lossiemouth, still Colonel-in-Chief of the Royal Irish Regiment, the Small Arms School Corps, and 5 other units. After January 13th, every one of those affiliations was gone. Sources told The Guardian they wouldn't be returned to Andrew. The Guardian reported that the decision had been widely discussed among senior members of the royal family, including the Prince of Wales and the Duke of Cambridge. It was understood to have been made by mutual agreement between the Queen and Andrew, but the ultimate decision fell to the monarch. That same week, more than 150 military veterans had written to the Queen, describing their upset and anger and calling Andrew's position untenable. The letter, partly coordinated by the campaign group Republic, stated, "Were this any other senior military officer, it's inconceivable that he would still be in post." They wrote to her in her capacity as Commander-in-Chief of the Army, Navy, and Air Force, and concluded with a personal appeal. "We understand that he is your son, but we write to you in your capacity as head of state. These steps could have been taken at any time in the past 11 years. Please don't leave it any longer." Neil Kelly, a former corporal in the Army Intelligence Corps and one of the signatories, told The Guardian afterward that he believed the letter was a factor, but that the judge's decision had also clearly weighed heavily. He'd been reading a report that the House of Windsor was looking for a way to distance itself from Andrew when the palace announcement came. Another signatory, Nicholas Alderton, a former senior aircraftman in the RAF, said he'd felt compelled to act because Andrew seemed to be trying to hide behind the process. Norman Baker, a commentator on royal matters and former government minister, said Andrew had been well and truly chucked under the royal bus, but added that the royal family couldn't escape the immense damage the case was doing. The BBC's royal correspondent, Nicholas Witchell, framed it explicitly. "This is now about the protection of the royal family's reputation. This is likely to do, and is already doing, considerable reputational damage. It's being followed around the world." One detail from The Guardian underscored that this was final, not temporary. Andrew still remained, technically, a counselor of state, one of the constitutional stand-ins for the sovereign if the monarch is abroad or incapacitated. As ninth in line to the throne, he couldn't be stripped of that role by a palace statement. But the Guardian noted it was effectively meaningless. As a non-working royal, he would never be asked. 5 weeks later, in February 2022, Andrew reached a settlement with Giuffre. The BBC reported he would pay an undisclosed financial sum. CNN confirmed the case was dismissed after payment. NPR reported the filing noted Giuffre would confirm receipt of the settlement within 30 days. As part of the agreement, Andrew acknowledged that Giuffre suffered as an established victim of abuse and made a substantial donation to a charity supporting victims' rights. He made no admission of liability. After the settlement, the question that hovered over the institution was whether some path might eventually reopen. The evidence from credible palace-adjacent sources was uniformly negative. Nick Bullen, co-founder of True Royalty TV and a veteran royal programming producer, told Fox News Digital in September 2022, shortly after Queen Elizabeth's funeral, that Andrew's life as a working royal was well and truly over. He didn't hedge. A role for Prince Andrew just doesn't exist anymore. He won't be given any of his military titles again. He's not going to be a working royal again. So I think we won't be seeing very much of him on the public stage. King Charles, by this point, was already signaling a different future. Bullen noted that having Prince George and Princess Charlotte visible at the Queen's funeral was a deliberate choice. "This is the future," Bullen said. Charles had been widely reported to be planning a slimmed-down monarchy, concentrated on immediate heirs rather than the extended family. Flickers of attempted re-entry were smothered. In March 2022, Andrew appeared at Prince Philip's memorial service at Westminster Abbey. He arrived alongside the Queen, supporting her as she walked with a walking stick to her seat. It was the first significant public event he'd attended in months, and it drew immediate backlash. That proved to be the exception, not the start of a return. Andrew was banned from the Buckingham Palace balcony during the Platinum Jubilee celebrations 3 months later. Royal commentators said it proved there was no way back. Sex abuse victims of Epstein were reported to be frustrated by Andrew's brief return to public view, with some accusing him of trying to rehabilitate his public image. Under Charles's reign, the containment became more thorough. Andrew didn't attend Trooping the Color. He was excluded from the Garter Day ceremony for 4 consecutive years. His public appearances were reduced to private family events, funerals, memorials, the occasional church walk. Even those were carefully managed. At a royal Easter service at St. George's Chapel in Windsor, Prince William reportedly made a conscious effort to maintain distance from his uncle. Royal commentator Hilary Fordwich told Fox News, "Prince William so wants his Uncle Andrew to vanish from public view." One source told The Sun, "The door to a return is firmly closed." Yahoo Entertainment reported that insiders considered Andrew unlikely to return to royal duties under William's future reign, with the Prince of Wales reportedly viewing his uncle's connections to Epstein as a reputational threat to the monarchy itself. Newsweek referred in 2022 to Prince Andrew's attempted comeback, tied to public appearance controversies. Sky News Australia reported he remained toxic to charities, amid rumors of new business ventures and attempts to launch a public return. None of them gained traction. The BBC's analysis noted, "The bigger risk could be that there is now a firewall between the public and the monarchy because of the handling of Andrew," a warning that even the management of his exclusion carried its own dangers. The final catalyst arrived in the autumn of 2025. On October 12th, British newspapers revealed that Andrew had sent an email to Epstein on February 28th 2011. More than 2 months after the date, Andrew had told Emily Maitlis he'd severed all ties with the convicted sex offender. That December 2010 meeting in New York, the one where they were photographed walking through Central Park, the one Andrew described on Newsnight as an effort to end the friendship honorably. The email appeared to show contact continuing well beyond it. In the email, Andrew wrote, "We are in this together, and will have to rise above it." The Independent had reported separately that emails between Andrew and Epstein, handed to a court in London, showed messages continuing until at least late February 2011, with Andrew writing, "Keep in close touch, and we'll play some more soon." These exchanges appeared to occur on the same day a photograph of Andrew with 17-year-old Virginia Giuffre and Ghislaine Maxwell was first published. 5 days after the newspaper revelations, on October 17, 2025, the BBC reported Andrew's own statement. "In discussion with the King and my immediate and wider family, we have concluded the continued accusations about me distract from the work of His Majesty and the royal family. He would no longer use his Duke of York title or other honors, including his membership of the Order of the Garter." The BBC noted it was understood the decision had been taken in close consultation with King Charles and Prince William. Robert Hardman, a royal biographer who'd written a biography of Charles, told the BBC News Channel that Andrew was dressing this up as if it was his decision, when really it would have been made by the palace. Hardman added, "I think the palace has decided, and Prince Andrew has agreed, that there really has to be a further separation. He wants to look as if he's proactive and try and regain some dignity out of this." Former BBC royal correspondent Jenny Bond was more blunt. "We could say he has fallen on his sword, but I think he's been pushed onto it. I don't think this is a decision that Andrew, quite an arrogant man, very, very fond of his status, would have willingly made without a lot of pressure." Bond added she believed enormous pressure had been exerted from both the King and Prince William. The BBC separately reported that Prince William had also been consulted on the decision to remove Andrew's titles. 13 days later, on October 30th, Charles went further than a voluntary relinquishment. The palace initiated the formal process: the Prince title, the HRH styling, the Royal Lodge lease, all of it. Andrew would be Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, resident of a property on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk. The palace would privately fund his accommodation. CBS reported that Sandringham, a 31-square-mile estate privately owned by the King, would be his new base. The monarchy's method, across these 6 years, followed a pattern visible in every palace statement: brief, formal, engineered to sound mutual, and always moving in one direction. November 2019. The Queen has given permission for Prince Andrew to step back from public duties for the foreseeable future. January 2022. With the Queen's approval and agreement, the Duke of York's military affiliations and royal patronages have been returned to the Queen. October 2025. Buckingham Palace announced a formal process to remove the style, titles, and honors of Prince Andrew. Each statement slightly longer, each slightly more severe, each framed as though Andrew had been consulted, had agreed, had participated. Given permission, with approval and agreement, initiated a formal process. The institution never argued with him publicly, never refuted his claims of innocence, never issued long justifications. It simply reduced his status, waited, then reduced it again. The AP captured the institutional logic in its October 2025 headline: King Charles III banishes Andrew to buttress the monarchy. Rob Shuter, a former publicist who once represented Princess Michael of Kent, wrote in The Hollywood Reporter that Andrew's removal was textbook Windsor, frictionless, silent, irreversible. He described what he'd seen firsthand inside the machinery: When you embarrass the crown, the palace doesn't argue, it doesn't plead, it erases. The monarchy, Shooter wrote, treats embarrassment like infection. To survive centuries, it amputates to save the body. His biography was quietly removed from the royal family's website. His Savage Club membership was formally withdrawn. Other establishments followed. Restaurants and nightclubs declined him entry. One source told reporters, "Andrew is simply too controversial to accommodate. No one wants the optics of him walking through their doors." 6 years of sourced reporting reveal a consistent pattern. Andrew's operational isolation began in November 2019, within days of the Newsnight interview. His formal institutional severance came on January 13, 2022, when the Queen returned his military affiliations and patronages, and the palace declared him a private citizen. His final public codification came on October 30, 2025, when Buckingham Palace initiated the removal of his remaining titles, honors, and style, and served notice over Royal Lodge. At no point between those dates did any authoritative source report a restoration of duties, patronages, or military roles. The BBC noted in its 2025 analysis that palace sources described the decision as rooted in serious lapses of judgment in Andrew's behavior. Andrew himself, in his October 2025 statement, said he vigorously denies the accusations against him. He remains eighth in line to the throne, a constitutional fact that no palace statement can alter. He is technically still a counselor of state, though as a non-working royal, he would never be asked to serve. His daughters retain their titles under King George V's Letters Patent of 1917, as daughters of the son of a sovereign. His place in the line of succession continues. But every visible marker of his royal life, every title, every honor, every uniform, every residence, every patronage, every chair at every ceremony, every page on every website, has been removed. Not in one blow, in 3, measured, sequential. Each one closing a door that would stay closed while the next one was being identified. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor learned what the institution teaches every member who becomes incompatible with its survival. The monarchy doesn't fight. It files paperwork. It drafts statements. It phrases the severance as agreement and the eviction as relocation. It waits for you to realize that the rooms are locked, the calls have stopped, the coat of arms has come down, the removal trucks are at the gate. And the statement on royal.uk is the only obituary your public life will ever receive. In palaces, the most decisive words are the ones that are never spoken aloud. Subscribe for more stories like this.